Welcome back, everybody. Let's give this a second go. Hopefully everyone's audio and video works this time. If not, be sure to email me and I'll do my best to fix the technical issues. Today, we're focusing on what historians refer to as the rise of the Asian bloc within the capitalist global economy. Specifically, a number of nations that are sometimes referred to as the East Asian tigers or dragons. First among them is Japan. United by a common economic outlook and investment and trade, Japan was followed down the path to growth by neighboring states such as Taiwan and South Korea. And they focused on state-directed growth, not central planning, not a planned economy like we see in the People's Republic of China under Mao or the Soviet Union, but the state kind of guiding growth with an emphasis on exports and light manufacturing. Simultaneously, the choice to follow this model paved by Japan within the Asian bloc forced countries like Taiwan and South Korea to also pursue political reform and abandon dictatorships in the 1980s and early 1990s, and instead open up their political life to multi-party democracy. And this was thought that because a lot of American and Japanese thinkers thought that you needed a free press, you needed multiple political parties, you needed rights such as freedom of speech in order for a free market system to thrive and flourish. If not, they wouldn't work. You couldn't have a liberal political life, or I'm sorry, you couldn't have a liberal free market open economy and not have an open political system. The two just wouldn't work at the same time. Japan's economic miracle in the 1960s and 1970s drew from a number of factors. One was the quality of Japanese goods shipped overseas in areas such as electronics and automobiles, enjoyed great prestige and were avidly sought by American and European consumers. Simultaneously, Japan benefited from U.S. security because they didn't have a conventional military and were under the umbrella of American protection. Instead, the Japanese government spent on things like technology, education, infrastructure, and healthcare. And U.S. aid helped kickstart Japan's recovery. Over $2 billion was spent by the American government in a span of 5 years. This helped its international companies also with gain access to sell goods to American homes and buyers until after the 1970s. So the United States not only pumped money into Japan's economy, they also reduced barriers to Japanese firms selling goods in the American economy. Another factor was that its growth was stimulated by high savings rates and benefited from state support and guidance. For example, the government would often meet with industry leaders in the form of keiretsu, and government officials selected markets where Japanese goods were likely to do well, and then they gave subsidies to companies to help push exports in that direction. So Japan might say, I think our automobiles are going to do well in California and the United States, and any Japanese automaker like Toyota that sends cars to that market is going to receive like tax relief or a lowering of their tax rates. That would be an example of the type of subsidies that we see. Japan's achievements in the realm of economics by the 1980s were outstanding. Its share of world exports quadrupled from 1955 to 1985, and per capita income for Japanese citizens had risen to levels comparable with West Germany and better than the United Kingdom. By the 80s, then, 8 of the 10 largest banks in the world were also centered in Japan. So it also had by then become kind of a financial capital for much of the global economy, not only at home but abroad. Following Japan then were the little dragons. South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong used the infrastructure left over from colonialism to build a vital export-geared economy to many of those same European countries that had once colonized these areas, or to the United States by allying with the US and its allies in the Cold War. Allied with powerful companies like Samsung and Hyundai and advised by technocrats, leaders in South Korea such as Park Chung-hee exported cars, electronics, radios, autos, and eventually computers and cell phones. Through loans and subsidies, these states encouraged companies to take profits and also reinvest them in research and development to improve manufacturing efficiency, the quality of their products, and develop new technologies such as robots, which if we flip back to our slide on Japan, not only is it home to 8 of the world's 10 largest banks, it also is the world leader in robotics by the 1980s, which presents some problems as well as some advantages for the economy. Uh, Once joined by nations such as China as a trade partner, supplier of cheap labor and raw materials, the GDP of Asia then, with these surging economies in these areas, made the world pivotal to the global economy and drew greater and greater attention from the US and Europe. So as these economies grew, they were sought after by investors from other areas of the global economy. And so they start to see double-digit growth rates. And as that's happening, you're getting a larger and larger middle class. You're getting a larger class of people with high school and even college education, people that manage their own firms, that have degrees that make them professionals such as lawyers, doctors, school teachers, journalists, engineers. And just like we saw in many other world revolutions in areas such as France and the United States in earlier centuries, then these people, given their greater status and their greater wealth and aspirations, are putting pressure and criticism into the public sphere in newspapers and public spaces that then forced states like South Korea and Taiwan to give them greater political participation, especially as the threat of communism from states like the People's Republic of China kind of fades after rapprochement, after Nixon and Mao make nice, and Deng Xiaoping and Carter open up trade and cultural exchange between the US and China. Then there's really nothing to legitimize the need for strong military rule in South Korea and Taiwan. They can open up to multi-party systems. And so we see those two states democratize in the 1980s. Singapore, though, represents this counterpoint to that. Singapore was founded by the British in 1819 as a trading colony on an island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula to help facilitate trade with China and India by the British Empire. Previously, the area had been a port and trading hub for past Southeast Asian empires and city-states, but under British control, it quickly grew and attracted throngs of migrants not only from Europe, but China, India, and Muslim Malays from inside the peninsula. For a brief time after the Second World War, it was a part of the Malaysian Federation, so it went through decolonization and this struggle with communists that we've referenced before called the Malayan Emergency. But Singapore then seceded in 1965, or rather it was abandoned by Malaysia and the large city and capital of Kuala Lumpur as a headache. Singapore in the mid-1960s was among the world's poorest cities. It was overrun with problems related to a housing scarcity, to rampant fires, filth, racially motivated riots and violence between Muslim Malays, between Chinese living in the city, between communists and revolutionaries everywhere. And essentially, Singapore is this problem child. Most especially, it was thought that kind of the diversity of the city's inhabitants, not just racially, as we mentioned, or ethnically, with Chinese, Malays, Europeans, and Indians, but it's also home to a diversity of world religions. There's Christians, there's Buddhists, there's Muslims, would make stability in the future impossible. And so you see it kind of pushed out of this newly formed country called Malaysia. Control over the city was seized by the People's Action Party and its leader Lee Kuan Yew from 1959 to 1990. Lee adopted a plan very similar to Japan, focus on exports and trade with the West, and then use revenue generated by that trade and exports to invest in education, city planning, and training for the workforce. Strategically located at the center of Southeast Asian sea lanes, Singapore was in effect much like Egypt's Suez Canal. It thrived by becoming the through points for goods coming and going from the world to Asia and back again. Nearby Malaysia was one of the fastest growing world economies in the 1960s and 1970s. It was rich in raw materials such as rubber, tin, and petroleum. And Singapore in part grew strong by helping those products reach the outside world. So you can see up here is the Malaysian Peninsula, okay? And that economy is growing very fast in the 1960s and 1970s. And Singapore is going to become this hub for shipping those goods and those raw materials overseas to industrialized countries near, like Japan, and far, like the United States. More so, Singapore's government and banks became a major financier of trade and helped create the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, okay? Which became a platform for regional cooperation and commerce. Member states by the 1990s were home to 500 million people, and trade and GDP worth over $700 billion. So by following that economic model, we see Singapore have its own economic miracle. By 1965, when it is kind of kicked out of Malaysia, the average income of its residents, of a few million people, is around $500 annually. By today, by the mid 2012, that had risen to over 100-fold. The average income was 5.5 million people averaged on their income $65,000 a year, and it ranked in the top 10 of the United Nations Human Development Complex, meaning things like people's standard of education, how much education they had, their life expectancy, their material abundance, their income, all those things factored in. And Singapore now is at the top 10. So it goes from kind of the bottom of the world cities to the very top, essentially. Lee, though, was also a dictator, and the People's Action Party devoted much of their energy to making the city perfectly clean. Crimes such as pollution carry with them fines upwards of several $100s. Caning is a popular form of punishment for things such as theft or vandalism. Even long hair was prohibited for many years, and most crimes or forms of immorality in Singapore were subject to fines, imprisonment, or even arrest. Drugs consumed in small amounts could even result in the death penalty. Moreover, to stifle political opposition, Lee and the People's Action Party used control over the media, the courts, and gerrymandering to ensure majorities in government, and those that ran against them or criticized them in the press were subject to libel suits that were often used to bankrupt people that criticized Lee Kuan Yew and his party. Even when rival parties managed to elect officials to the government, Lee and the People's Action Party, by virtue of their majority, used their power to deplete that district's funding for things such as schools and healthcare or sanitation, and that created a really strong incentive to replace that elected official in the next cycle with an official that was loyal to Lee and his party. At the same time, to create unity, the party rewarded elected officials with very high salaries for government service, attracting talent away from the private sector and many multinational corporations that were recruited to set up bases of operations in Singapore in the 1960s and 1970s. Secondly, Lee promoted the idea of Singapore and other capitalist countries in Asia as representing a distinct style of capitalism rooted in Confucian values such as hard work, elite rule, and social order, and also was very critical of Western-style capitalism and democracy as promoting things like freedom, materialism, decadence, crime, and immorality that would ultimately be a corrosive force in society and thus must be guarded against by Asian-style countries in adopting capitalism. Okay. So how are we to make sense of Singapore's combination of free market economics, cooperation with the US in the Cold War, and reliance on draconian laws and dictatorship? Well, one measure is the United Nations system of evaluating the health of a nation, which kind of looks at this in three baskets. The first concerns the structure of the government. Is it set up to be a democracy? The second is, the first is to see if the government is set up to be a democracy, and then to gauge how much civic participation there is. How much can people actually run for office or vote, or what are their rights and freedoms that are protected by law? The second basket concerns the effectiveness of a government in addressing issues and the integrity of its system. That could be like if the government implements legislation to improve public schools, does it actually work? Like, do we see an improvement in schools and education? And how long did that take? And then that reference to integrity of the system talks about whether or not officials are corrupt, whether or not they use government to enrich their own purse. Okay? And then the third basket here deals with the standard of living of the people as measured by their income, by their health, and their safety. Does the government actually create an environment that allows most of its people to flourish? Okay, we'll finish our lecture on Singapore in the second video, which will be posted after this one.